He thought his life was solid, predictable, safe. For 23 years, Miles had built a world of routines, small, steady rituals that made him feel in control. He liked knowing where his keys were, how much money sat in the family budget, and when each of his 3 kids would come home. He wasn't a man of grand adventures or sudden impulses. He was a man of structure, and that structure was his fortress. Together with Vanessa, he'd built a life that, from the outside, looked almost enviable. A sturdy marriage, 3 healthy children, a comfortable home, financial stability, all the checkmarks of a life well lived. Their friends used to call them the steady couple, the ones who never fought in public, who hosted dinner parties with practiced ease. But time has a way of wearing down even the strongest foundations, not through storms, but through quiet erosion. The marriage wasn't what it used to be, but Miles had learned to accept that as normal. After all, who keeps the same spark after 2 decades of bills, children, and aging bodies? Vanessa had grown quieter, more inward, but she was there, present, reliable. And he had long stopped expecting spontaneous kisses or the long hugs they used to share in the kitchen. What Miles didn't see was that while he was preserving order, something inside their home and inside his wife was quietly slipping out of his grasp. It was Zoe, their youngest, who sensed it first. She had her mother's eyes, sharp, intuitive, and full of quiet curiosity. While her older siblings, Chloe and Dylan, were lost in their own worlds, college stress and endless video games, Zoe noticed the little shifts that adults often ignore. It began with small, almost innocent discoveries. A skirt she had never seen before, short, tight, too youthful for her mother's usual taste. Vanessa brushed it off with a smile, saying she was just refreshing her wardrobe. Then came the lipstick, a deep, unapologetic red that had never belonged in their bathroom, the kind of shade that announces itself before you walk into a room. And then there was the perfume, sweet but bold, the kind that lingered long after she left for work. It hung in the hallway like a ghost of something unspoken. Zoe didn't understand it fully, but she felt the change. Her mother's aura was different, distracted yet radiant in a strange way. Miles, meanwhile, was buried in his spreadsheets, convinced that predictability meant peace. His life moved by numbers, meetings, expenses, deadlines, until the day an email arrived, a credit card statement for Vanessa's account. At first, nothing unusual, groceries, pharmacy, school supplies, but then his eyes caught it. A charge for an expensive restaurant on a Tuesday afternoon, then a florist in a neighborhood far from her office. His stomach clenched. He opened the full statement, more small purchases, spread out carefully, almost strategically. Too tidy, too thought out. Not the kind of spending that happens by accident. For the first time in years, Miles felt his throat go dry. Something was off. That night, while Zoe was doing her homework, he asked the question he'd been rehearsing in silence. "Have you noticed anything different about your mom lately?" Zoe looked up immediately. She didn't hesitate. It was like she had been waiting for someone to finally say it out loud. She told him about the new clothes, the makeup, the perfume. Her tone was uncertain, apologetic, as if she feared betraying her mother. "Maybe she just wants to feel pretty again," Zoe said softly. Miles nodded, forcing a smile. He thanked her, told her not to worry, and excused himself to the bedroom. But his mind was already spinning. That night, while the house slept, he sat in the dim light of his office, staring at the numbers again. They weren't just expenses. They were breadcrumbs, a trail leading somewhere he didn't want to go. The next morning, without telling anyone, Miles went to his lawyer. His voice didn't tremble, but his heart did. He requested 3 documents: a separation agreement, a post-nuptial contract, and formal divorce papers, all to be prepared quietly. No confrontations, no drama, just self-preservation. As the lawyer drafted them, memories flooded his mind in painful flashes. The first Christmas tree they decorated together, the day Vanessa told him she was pregnant with Chloe, the sleepless nights when they couldn't afford much but had each other. Those memories, once warm, now burned cold. That evening, at dinner, Vanessa spoke with her usual calm, smiling faintly as she asked about everyone's day. But Miles barely heard her words. He was too busy watching her. Her hands, her eyes, her movements. She looked relaxed, maybe too relaxed, maybe because she thought everything was still hidden. Across the table, Zoe watched her parents like someone reading a story whose ending she already knew. There was tension beneath the surface, a silence that was louder than any argument. Later that night, when Vanessa stepped into the shower, Miles went to the office. He opened the bottom drawer of the cabinet and took out 3 envelopes, the ones he had asked his lawyer to prepare. Inside them lay the future he didn't want, but was ready for. He reread every page, line by line, like a man checking the instructions before detonating his own life. When Vanessa came out, her hair still wet, he called her into the bedroom. His voice was steady, but his heart pounded in his chest like a drum of war. She entered, stopped in her tracks when she saw the papers laid neatly on the bed. She froze. No words, no questions, just silence thick enough to feel in the air. Miles didn't waste time. Is there someone else? The question dropped between them like a blade. Vanessa blinked, hesitated, then smiled faintly, almost nervously. You're overthinking, Miles. It's nothing like that. But he didn't look away. His eyes were steady, piercing. The eyes of a man who already knew the truth, but needed to hear it to believe it. Tell me the truth, Vanessa. Her voice cracked. She tried to hold his gaze, but couldn't. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Then finally, she exhaled, and the truth began to leak out. Not in full, not yet, but enough to destroy what was left of their peace. She confessed that there was someone, a man she worked with, a name Miles already knew before she said it. Grant Walters Grant, the charming divorced colleague she once mentioned after a company dinner, the one she said was funny and easy to talk to. He dismissed it back then as harmless admiration. Now it returned like poison through the veins. Miles's body went rigid. He asked the question every betrayed heart dreads. Did you sleep with him? Vanessa's lips trembled. No, but there were feelings. We got close. Too close. We kissed. Miles said nothing. He didn't move, didn't shout. The pain was too deep for noise. Her words fell over him like shards of glass, each syllable cutting through years of trust. She tried to justify herself, said she'd felt invisible, lost, like she needed to remember she still existed as a woman, that after the kids grew up, she didn't know who she was anymore, that Grant made her feel alive again. Miles listened, but his expression didn't change. His silence was louder than any anger could be. When she finished, he placed the documents on the dresser and said quietly, "You can sign them whenever you're ready." She didn't beg, didn't scream. She just stood there, her eyes hollow, her shoulders shaking almost imperceptibly. Hours later, Miles locked himself in the office. The house felt heavier than it ever had before. His phone buzzed again and again, long, desperate messages from Vanessa, apologies, explanations, words like emptiness, mistake, regret. She said she had ended things with Grant, said she'd give up everything to fix what she broke. The next afternoon, when Miles returned home, an envelope waited for him on the kitchen table. Inside were the signed documents, all 3. No notes, no tears, no ink smudges, just signatures. But there was a letter. It was short, painfully so. Vanessa's handwriting trembled slightly, but her words were clear. She wrote that she was willing to lose everything except one thing, the chance to still be part of his life. That line, simple and raw, hit Miles harder than all the confessions combined. He had expected resistance, denial, maybe even manipulation, but not surrender, not this quiet collapse of pride. That night, Miles lay awake staring at the ceiling, memories attacking him in waves. Chloe's first day of school, Dylan's laughter, Zoe asleep on Vanessa's chest during thunderstorms. Each one now felt like a relic from a past life, from a love that might never return. He wanted to hate her. God, he tried to. But beneath the wreckage, something stubborn still beat inside him, something that refused to die completely. And as he stared into the dark, the question that would haunt him for months began to echo in his mind. Is love still love when trust is gone? The answer he knew wouldn't come easily, because this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of the reckoning. The days that followed were a strange limbo, a suspended reality where life went on but felt hollow. Miles moved through the house like a man in a half-remembered dream, performing routines by muscle memory while his mind wandered in the debris of betrayal. Vanessa, for her part, seemed aware of the chasm between them, walking lightly as if her feet could somehow erase the damage, trying not to stir up the raw, unspoken emotions that lingered in every room. There were meals to prepare, bills to pay, children to see off, laundry to fold, and yet every small gesture was weighed down by the knowledge of what had been revealed. Miles didn't speak much, and when he did, it was in clipped, careful sentences that left no room for the emotional intricacies he refused to articulate. Vanessa adapted without complaint, sensing that every inch of closeness would have to come from him if they were to rebuild anything at all, and the awareness of her vulnerability made the air between them simultaneously heavier and strangely tender. He watched her with cautious eyes, noting the way her hands moved as she carried cups of coffee to the table, the almost imperceptible tremor in her shoulders as she set them down. There was regret etched into every line of her face, a quiet, resigned sorrow that seemed to beg for acknowledgement without words. And for the first time in decades, Miles felt the weight of their shared history in a way that was more painful than anger, more devastating than betrayal. The children sensed it too. Zoe, ever perceptive, tried to hold the household together with jokes, hugs, and laughter, as though she could fill the invisible void with her own innocence. Chloe, busy with college, called often, trying to check in without prying, and Dylan retreated further into the digital worlds of his games, headphones shielding him from the tension that permeated the walls. Life in the house continued, but it was as though they were all actors playing their parts, while the stage itself had been subtly tilted, shifting beneath their feet. Miles found solace in routines that weren't tied to the home, the gym, business meetings, social obligations that gave him structure without emotional exposure. It was during these moments, away from Vanessa and the lingering scent of her perfume in their shared spaces, that he could breathe without feeling the constant pull of disappointment and residual love. Yet even in these escapes, he couldn't completely shed the image of Vanessa, her face etched with silent pleas, the letter in her hand, her confessions lingering in his memory like a shadow that refused to dissipate. She'd made herself vulnerable in a way that demanded a response, but his response was complicated, tangled in pride, love, and betrayal. He wanted to punish her, to make her feel the fracture she had caused, yet there was also a stubborn part of him that refused to abandon decades of intimacy, of shared history. Every night he lay awake, analyzing every word she had sent, every gesture she had made since the revelation, and trying to determine whether the love that remained was enough to overcome the damage. The signed documents sat on the dresser like monuments to potential endings, and he would occasionally touch them, read through the lines as if the ink contained some secret formula that could guide his next steps. He recognized painfully that he could destroy everything, walk away, and yet a small, rebellious part of his heart refused to let go entirely. It was this part that made the house simultaneously unbearable and magnetic, drawing him back into the very space he wanted to flee. Vanessa, for her part, navigated the aftermath with a careful balance of distance and subtle attentiveness. She didn't plead, didn't force interactions, but she performed acts of care with an almost quiet, ritualistic grace. Meals were prepared with thought, the kitchen left spotless, laundry folded and placed neatly, schedules coordinated without a single complaint or question. She had learned that words could exhaust him, could reopen wounds that were already tender, so she let her actions speak in place of explanations. Yet even in her quiet diligence, there was a visible transformation. A woman battered by guilt, but not broken entirely, learning to inhabit her life again in a way that acknowledged both her mistakes and her desire to reconnect. Her eyes would occasionally meet his, briefly, and he could see in them a flicker of the woman he had fallen in love with decades ago. Strong, intelligent, and alive, though shadowed now by remorse. These moments were fleeting, often disappearing before he could respond, leaving him in a liminal state of hope and doubt, uncertain whether they could bridge the canyon that had opened between them. One afternoon, he decided to test the boundaries, not with confrontation, but with observation. The company's year-end party was approaching, and though he had not yet committed, he chose to attend, inviting Zoe to accompany him. It was a calculated decision, meant to occupy his mind while observing how his presence outside the home affected the fragile dynamics of his internal life. The event itself was a blur of forced smiles, congratulatory handshakes, laughter that didn't quite reach the eyes, and colleagues who commented on his different energy, oblivious to the real turmoil simmering beneath his composed exterior. A colleague, Rachel, notorious for pushing boundaries when drinks loosened inhibitions, approached with exaggerated familiarity, laughter too loud and touches too intimate. Miles responded with polite but firm detachment, gently extricating himself from her advances and returning to Zoe's side, noting her furrowed brow as she watched from afar. Her question, quiet but direct, struck him like a lightning bolt. "Do you still love Mom?" It was a question loaded with innocence and piercing awareness, and Miles, caught off guard, remained silent. There were no easy answers. Love existed, fractured and complicated, alongside betrayal and disappointment. How does one explain the coexistence of attachment and pain to a child who is only beginning to understand the complexities of human emotion? He swallowed hard, realizing that silence, in this instance, was as much an answer as words could ever convey. Days passed with a rhythm that was both familiar and foreign. Zoe spent nights at friends' houses, Dylan disappeared into gaming marathons, Chloe remained absorbed in studies, and the house felt like a stage of empty echoes, every footstep and kettle whistle amplified by the silence between Miles and Vanessa. One morning, he asked her casually, almost clinically, to undergo medical tests. It wasn't about suspicion of infidelity beyond what she had confessed, but about trust. The fragile, essential trust that had been fractured. She complied without hesitation, returning a few days later with a clean result, yet the relief was muted. The test did not heal the wound, did not restore the invisible bond that had been violated. It only confirmed that there was no physical evidence of continued betrayal. What remained, intangible and weighty, was the fracture in emotional intimacy, the silent acknowledgement that one person had drifted emotionally and the other was left to measure the consequences. Miles began a quiet process of reconstruction, not outwardly visible but deeply internal. He engaged more with work, socialized selectively with friends who provided distraction without judgment, returned to the gym with renewed discipline, and sought to reclaim some sense of self that had been swallowed by anger and grief. Vanessa, meanwhile, did not intrude. She respected his distance, performing her duties at home, organizing, caring, and attending to the children without seeking reward or recognition. Her humility and presence, once irritating in its restraint, slowly became a balm to the raw edges of his psyche. They existed in proximity but not closeness, the hallway between their bedrooms a silent metaphor for the space that trust had once filled. Small gestures began to emerge, imperceptible to anyone else but monumental to Miles. The way she placed the cup of coffee exactly where he liked it, the careful folding of laundry, the quiet acknowledgement of routine tasks that had once been invisible. These gestures were not apologies, nor were they promises. They were acts of recognition, subtle affirmations that she still wished to inhabit the shared life they had built, even if the past could never be erased. Miles noticed these changes with a cautious optimism, the smallest nods of hope mingling with the enduring sting of betrayal. It was a delicate equilibrium, a tension between the memory of love and the reality of broken trust. He found himself thinking, often against his own will, about the possibility of rebuilding, not to erase what had happened, but to transform it into something stronger, more conscious, and more deliberate. Then came an evening when the house was quiet in a way that allowed the gravity of the past weeks to settle. Zoe was at a friend's, Dylan at the movies, Chloe still at college. Miles was reading on the couch when Vanessa appeared with 2 mugs of tea, placing one gently on the table. She asked quietly if he wanted sugar. He didn't answer, merely took the mug and sipped. For a long moment, silence stretched across the living room. Then she began to speak of trivial things, an old movie they had both loved in their youth, memories of their children, anecdotes from the past that were light enough to share without forcing emotional confrontation. Miles listened, not offering judgments, not weighing words for betrayal, but simply listening. Vanessa laughed softly at the story of Chloe nearly burning the cake she had attempted to bake. Miles smiled faintly, a small, involuntary acknowledgement that humor and memory still existed despite the cracks. She thanked him for protecting the children from the details of their crisis, understanding instinctively that full transparency would have been too heavy for young hearts to bear. In these shared moments, Miles felt a subtle shift, not reconciliation, not forgiveness yet, but recognition. The raw edges of pain softened slightly, giving way to the faint glimmer of something he could not yet name but felt necessary, the possibility of presence over absence. As the days continued, Vanessa moved more confidently within the space they shared, still cautious, still respectful of his boundaries, but gradually allowing traces of her former self to return. Miles, in turn, began to acknowledge memories without bitterness, moments without pain, and even laughter without guilt. The signed documents remained on the dresser, silent witnesses to potential endings, yet their presence became less a threat and more a reminder that choices were his to make. By the end of the second week, the household rhythm began to feel less like limbo and more like the tentative emergence of something new. Silence was no longer oppressive, it was contemplative, a space for both of them to exist without pretense. Actions replaced words, attention replaced indifference, and for the first time since the betrayal, Miles allowed himself to believe, however faintly, that the fragments of love that remained could form the foundation for rebuilding if only they were patient, careful, and unflinching in their honesty with themselves. The morning of their anniversary arrived with an almost surreal stillness, the kind of quiet that feels pregnant with memory, expectation, and unspoken tension. Miles woke before the children, as was often his habit, and moved through the kitchen with careful precision, making his coffee just the way he liked it. He held the cup in his hands, the warmth seeping into his palms, and allowed himself a few moments of stillness, a pause to contemplate the weight of the last weeks and the uncertainty of what the day might hold. The calendar bore the mark of 23 years, a reminder of the life they had built, the vows they had exchanged, and the routines that had defined them. In earlier years, this day would have been filled with small symbolic exchanges, gifts hidden on the nightstand, quiet messages of love whispered over breakfast, the casual intimacy of two people so intertwined that gestures became words. But this year, the rituals were absent. Nothing was different outwardly. The children left for school, the house hummed with the familiar cadence of appliances and footsteps, and yet the atmosphere was charged with the unseen, a tension that neither needed to articulate but both recognized fully. Miles sipped his coffee and allowed himself to reflect on what it meant to love and be betrayed, to feel the simultaneous pull of pride and memory, the conflicting desire to protect oneself and to allow healing to begin. Vanessa moved through the morning with quiet efficiency, performing her usual tasks, preparing meals, tidying the home, dropping the children off, without any outward acknowledgement of the anniversary. She carried herself as though the weight of the past weeks rested on her shoulders, not as a burden, but as a mantle she had chosen to bear with dignity. Miles noticed the small changes in her presence, the deliberate calm, the careful attentiveness, the subtle way she adjusted the household rhythm to accommodate his distance without imposing her own need for reassurance. There was humility in her movements, a patient acknowledgement of the emotional fissures between them, and yet in that humility was a strength that Miles could not ignore. It reminded him of the woman he had fallen in love with, the one who had once weathered heartbreak and disappointment, the one who had remained steadfast through his own moments of weakness. The letter she left for him earlier that week had been the catalyst for introspection, a confession that demanded honesty and reflection rather than reaction. It was a document of surrender, yes, but also a carefully constructed gesture of respect, an offering of her remaining self without expectation, without manipulation, a bare acknowledgement of fault, and the hope that fragments of love could survive even when trust had been shattered. The day progressed in a pattern that was simultaneously ordinary and extraordinary. Miles moved through his work obligations, attended meetings, made decisions, and yet each moment outside the home was punctuated by the awareness of Vanessa's presence in the world they shared. Each phone call, each message from their children reminded him of the interconnectedness that remained despite the rupture. By mid-afternoon, the house had emptied once more. Zoe at a friend's, Dylan at the movies, Chloe still immersed in her studies. The quiet allowed Miles to confront the lingering emotions that had settled into the corners of his mind, memories colliding with anticipation, grief intertwined with residual affection. It was in these spaces of isolation that he allowed himself to acknowledge the complexity of love, that it could exist simultaneously with anger, betrayal, disappointment, and hope. The signed documents remained visible on the dresser, yet their presence had begun to shift from ominous symbols of finality to markers of choice, reminders that the future, for all its uncertainty, was now firmly in his hands. He could choose to let go, to walk away from decades of shared experience, Or he could allow himself to entertain the possibility that rebuilding was not only possible, but necessary, even if it required navigating an uncharted emotional terrain with patience, humility, and courage. That evening, Vanessa appeared in the living room without announcement, 2 mugs in hand. The ritual of shared tea, unremarkable in its simplicity, carried the weight of reconciliation before any words were spoken. She placed the mugs carefully, acknowledged his preferred preparation, and for a long moment, silence enveloped them. The tension was present, but no longer suffocating. It was contemplative, a quiet space where trust could begin to reemerge in small increments. She spoke of trivial memories, of moments from their youth, of the children and their idiosyncrasies, of events that required laughter but not intimacy, gestures that invited connection without demanding immediate vulnerability. Miles listened, his responses measured but open to engagement, the first small acknowledgement that presence could be sustained without betrayal, that recognition and attention could replace resentment. The subtle shifts in tone, the shared smiles, the quiet understanding were monumental in their significance. They were no longer operating solely within the shadow of past errors. They were, however, cautiously participating in the delicate work of rebuilding. Days turned into weeks, each marked by cautious interaction, deliberate attention, and patient observation. Vanessa resumed work formally, divided household responsibilities more equitably, attended to details that had previously been overlooked or neglected, all without seeking praise or acknowledgement. Her actions spoke louder than words could, demonstrating an understanding that trust was rebuilt through consistent, deliberate presence rather than grand gestures or emotional appeals. Miles, for his part, began to shift from observation to engagement, from guarded skepticism to measured interaction, from self-protective withdrawal to deliberate participation in the life they had once shared. The house, once heavy with silence and unspoken tension, began to pulse with subtle signs of renewed equilibrium. The kettle's whistle no longer carried an oppressive weight. Footsteps in the hallway became less charged with avoidance. The rhythm of meals, chores, and small domestic interactions regained a sense of shared purpose rather than solitary execution. The children sensed it too, particularly Zoe, who remained intuitive, perceptive, and quietly protective, and who began to relax in the knowledge that her parents' world was, in some measure, finding its footing again. One afternoon, in the rare stillness of an empty house, Miles and Vanessa walked together after dinner, unplanned and unstructured. There were no speeches, no grand gestures, no declarations of future intention. They moved side by side along the sidewalk, the silence between them now carrying a different resonance, contemplative, reflective, and safe. Vanessa's hand brushed his arm in a gesture so subtle, so instinctive that it almost went unnoticed, yet the significance was monumental. Miles did not recoil. He allowed himself to feel the contact without analyzing, without judgment, without expectation. It was a bridge over a river of accumulated grief, a signal that small intimacies could exist again, that human connection could reemerge, even after profound disruption. Their conversation wandered through trivialities, observations of teenagers laughing nearby, comments about the weather, reflections on mundane events, yet each exchange, however minor, carried the weight of mutual recognition, an acknowledgement of shared space, shared history, and shared possibility. Back at home, in the hallway where the distance between rooms had once felt like a canyon, they paused. Vanessa spoke of her hope for future holidays with all 3 children under one roof, of memories she wished to preserve and new experiences she wished to create. Miles responded with careful acknowledgement, neither committing nor refusing, allowing space for possibility without imposing pressure. It was a fragile equilibrium, a conscious negotiation of emotional terrain that had been violently disrupted and was now tentatively restored. That night he went to bed not reviewing grievances or replaying confessions, but remembering moments of shared joy, of intimacy that predated the fracture, of ordinary beauty in the life they had created together. He slept, at last, without the gnawing weight of betrayal dominating his thoughts, allowing room for hope to emerge alongside memory. The following days were marked by incremental reconnection. Miles assumed more active roles in care and attention, preparing meals, assisting with bandages after Vanessa's minor accident, and engaging the children in routines that fostered a sense of normalcy. Vanessa, in turn, acted not from obligation, but from conscious participation, creating an atmosphere of reliability, presence, and accountability. Conversations that had once been fraught with tension were now approached with measured care, allowing for reflection without recrimination, acknowledgement without judgment. They did not attempt to erase the past. Rather, they transformed it into a foundation for something new. The signed documents remained in place, a silent testament to the choices that lay ahead, but their presence no longer dictated the emotional state of the household. Instead, they became markers of agency, reminders that the future was malleable, contingent on deliberate, intentional action. Miles and Vanessa came to understand a fundamental truth. Real love does not survive intact. It is battered, bruised, tested, and challenged. Yet when two people consciously choose to remain present, to engage despite pain, and to rebuild despite fractured trust, it can be transformed into something more resilient, more conscious, and more authentic. Their gestures became measured but meaningful, their presence deliberate but gentle, their interactions framed not by expectation but by choice. Shared silence replaced performative conversation, attentiveness replaced neglect, consistency replaced uncertainty. They learned to inhabit their love in fragments, each piece painstakingly placed, each interaction a brick in the reconstruction of trust. The past was not denied, nor was it forgotten. It was acknowledged, examined, and integrated, becoming the scaffolding upon which the fragile architecture of renewed connection could be built. In the final weeks of their tentative recovery, they moved through shared spaces with a sense of conscious presence. The children sensed the transformation, subtle but unmistakable, and the household regained its rhythm. Zoe, observant and intuitive, finally relaxed in the knowledge that her parents were no longer navigating emotional turbulence in isolation. Dylan, absorbed in his games, noticed only the reduction in tension and the quiet return of predictability. Chloe, distant but connected, remarked on the lighter atmosphere in passing, recognizing the subtle but profound shift. Miles and Vanessa did not attempt to accelerate the process, nor did they articulate promises they could not yet keep. They allowed the small, deliberate actions, the quiet attentiveness, and the restored presence to speak in place of words. And in these gestures, however minor externally, they found the possibility of new beginnings, fragile yet real, hopeful yet grounded in lived experience. For Miles, the process was a delicate negotiation between the weight of past betrayal and the remnants of enduring affection. He realized that the decision to remain, to rebuild, was not an act of blind forgiveness, nor a capitulation to love, but a conscious choice to inhabit a life that balanced memory, pain, and potential. Vanessa's acknowledgement of fault, her willingness to accept consequence, and her deliberate, consistent presence created an environment in which the fragments of trust could slowly knit together. It was a foundation built not on idealized love, but on deliberate engagement, shared responsibility, and the courage to face emotional truth without retreat. And so life began anew, not as a restoration of what had been, but as a reconstruction of what could be. Miles and Vanessa discovered that intimacy did not require perfection, that love did not demand unbroken trust, and that the resilience of the human heart often lies in its capacity to choose connection, even amidst vulnerability and risk. In their silence, in their shared routines, in their deliberate attentiveness to one another, they found fragments of a life worth inhabiting, moments that carried meaning precisely because they had been earned through struggle, reflection, and choice. They did not erase the past, they integrated it. They did not promise the future, they constructed it, one deliberate, present-filled moment at a time. And in this painstaking work, they discovered the profound truth that real love, though battered and bruised, can endure, adapt, and transform into something more conscious, more resilient, and infinitely more real than the untested affection of earlier years.